Kakadosh Boker Or Bekiim Bahalacha 3, day 9, the Siman Siman 5, page 14. We are going to be doing Halacha Tet Zayin. So pay attention. מנהג הספרדים לבטא אות נון של שם השם בקמץ רחב, right? הדומה לניקוד פתח, so it's like a patach. So when we say amo, right, amonai, so we're saying ado, and then obviously the nai, but it's with a patach, even though it's called a kamatz, but it's a patach. It's like a patach. Daikanim מבדילים קצת ביניהם. So, pronunciation, yeah, right? Meaning we're not going to do like the Ashkenazi that they don't noi. It's not noi, it's nai, right? So he says, that daikanim, they make a little tiny bit of a difference, because the kamatz is tnua gdola and kveda, and the patach is tnua ktana. It's a very small difference. They could come and make a differentiation by sheish benehem. So they're new people. They come from the yeshivot of Achenu Ashkenazim. And they start doing noi, right, which is shavel nikud cholam, kaverat Ashkenazim. That our pronunciation is proper. And so if you change, you got the lower hand. And it's not good. And he's disgracing the minhag of our forefathers and rabbis. And he's actually transgressing on al titosh Torah timecha. So let's see the footnotes. 295. Okay, the Hebrew vowels were given to us at Har Sinai, meaning nikudot is Har Sinai. Okay, the Maran and Yishol and Tzion asserted that it is impossible to prove conclusively whether or not the Sephardic tradition in pronouncing the Hebrew is correct or the Ashkenazic one, and each community should maintain its time-honored traditions. Maran Miprag taught that the vowels and pronunciations of the words of the Torah were taught from by Sinai. We were taught then which letters are punctuated with a kamatz, rapata, chatzere, segol, cholam, shuru, and so on. And at that time, however, there were no symbols given for the vowels. They were preserved as part of the oral tradition. The symbols we use today were developed later in history. So to me, that means to say that really, bizman matan Torah, kvar we had but we didn't have those symbols. We knew this is a patach, but we didn't have the symbols. Then later on it came. What about, so 1 second, did you guys realize also that all of them, right, all of them, for Sfaradim, they're always much closer in Havara than Ashkenazim. I'll give you an example. Seirei and Segul. So Ashkenazim do A and E, correct? Segul and Seirei, right? They do Tsei, A, right? Ours is basically the same, right? So there's a much smaller difference between the Tseirei and the Segul, the Kamatz and the Patach. That's for Sfaradim. Ashkenazim, they make a much bigger difference, okay? So let's start. So he says like this, comparing Kamatz to a Patach. Ashkenazic tradition teaches that the Kamatz is pronounced aw, as in the word saw or more, right? It's either aw or, right? So he says, well, the patach is pronounced like in the word what or bar, right? So he says Sephardic Jews, for the most part, do not differentiate between kamatz and patach, except for how they are accentuated. The response to Rav Palin, the Ben Ishai, commented that although there certainly is a difference between kamatz and patach, and between Seirei and Segul, in the last few generations, differences have been blurred, unfortunately. He noted that Rav Yaakov Emdin mentioned this in his works, commenting that it is a flaw in Sephardic tradition. He lamented the fact that Baghdad's Jews have barely any knowledge of this, and that they don't differentiate between the Sheva, Seirei, and Segul, or between the Kamatz and the Patach. The ignorance is equal among school children and adults, among the lay people and the cantors who are experts in chanting the Torah. Meaning, it doesn't matter whether you're Bekiim, the Kriyat Torah, and this. Okay. So the Rishon LeZion commented that there is going to be experts who take care to differentiate between kamatz, which is a longer vowel, and a patach, which is shorter. The difference is barely noticeable, except for those that are very similar to it, right? Familiar to it. So he says, now what about Rabbeinu Bachya? So listen to this. Rabbeinu Bachya comes and he says, on Parashat Vayera, Rabbeinu Bachya says that although the kamatz and patach appear to have identical sounds, in reality that is not so, right? The true kamatz is pronounced higher and longer, and the true patach is shorter. Some authorities claim that in the passage Rabbeinu Bachya admits that the Ashkenazic pronunciation is the correct one. But Tzvi Yitzchak Frank remarked that in modern times, many Ashkenazi Jews have adopted Sephardic tradition pronouncing Hebrew. And when mentioning the name of Hashem, right, they also say the same thing. And they say Nai instead of Noi. This, Ian says, is incorrect. After all, even Rabbi Bechai was a leading Sephardic Jew, right? He just said that it's proper to do it like the other way. Likewise, the response that Kol Mevaser wrote that when Ashkenazic Jews adopt the Sephardic traditions, it's much worse than when the Sephardic Jews adopt Ashkenazic traditions. He based this observation on the words of Rabbi Bechai, page 16. So the response of Minchat Yitzchak likewise also said the same thing. But the Rishon Tzion, he disagreed with the conclusion of these Achronim. On the contrary, the Rabbi Bechai's comments support the Sephardic traditions and is a challenge to the Ashkenazi traditions. Notice that Rabbi Bechai stated the sounds of Kamatz and Patach are almost identical. Ashkenazi Jews, however, pronounce them clearly distinct. So therefore, it's a proof that it was the opposite way. So in order to differentiate between Kamatz and Patach, Ashkenazic Jews add the sound of the letter Yod after the Cholam. So it rhymes with toy or void. So that's incorrect. At any rate, Rabbi Bechai was not referring to the Ashkenazic traditions, for he wrote that the Kamatz and Patach appear to be identical. That means that he was describing the Sephardic traditions, where there's only a subtle difference between the two sounds, which is the Kamatz and Patach. So if he had referring to the Ashkenazi, he would have been completely superfluous. Why? Because it's completely different. So this understanding, the complaint voiced by Rav Yaakov Emtin, is silenced as well. He claimed that the pronunciation, according to the Ashkenazi Jews, is superior. He says he didn't realize that an expert in the pronunciation of Sephardic Hebrew does differentiate between them, as we already said above. I mean, even we make a difference, but it's a very, very subtle, very small difference. It's not a huge difference that you're adding other letters to the nikudot. Similarly, right? So what is the similarity then in the Kamatz and Patach? Tosafot brings of Yitzchak el-Fasi, right? That he says, the Darif, that he says like this. He says that when saying Siman, it's necessary to pause slightly between the word, right? Vechara and af. Since without any pause, it sounds like one word, vecharaf, which would be blasphemous. Maran brings this down in Shulchan Aruch as well. This halacha makes sense if the sounds of the Kamatz and the Patach are almost identical in the matter of Sephardic tradition. According to the Ashkenazic tradition, however, even without any pause, the words would not sound like vecharaf, but they would sound like vechora waf, right? Vechora waf, which is meaningless, right? But not blasphemous. Meaning it's not like something against Hashem. It's just okay. There's no meaning to it. But it's not that it's blasphemy. It's blasphemous is only we would say v'charaf, right? Like cherpa, right? Chiref, right? Chiref v'gidef, right? So in the Krovitz composed for the prayers of Tisha B'Av, the poet uses the words, right, Hashem and Dini, that rhyme like each other. Likewise, in the ancient but still popular hymn of Tzur Mishur Achalnu, right, the refrain rims, right, he says the words Emunai and Amonai in the poem goes by Rishon ben Evinim Givriol. So in honor of the festival of Shavuot, also we say Sinai, Amonai, and Panai. Again, it's all rhymes. These things, they all rhyme. So if they're all rhyming, how does it rhyme? Right? It doesn't rhyme. Okay? So he says, right, Ashkenazic scholars acclaim the Sephardic tradition. Rav Yosef Schwartz, right, wrote, Ashkenazi Jews pronounce every kamatz as if it was a chataf kamatz, right? So he says Sephardic Jews are pronounced a regular kamatz like a patach. In my opinion, the Sephardic tradition is more likely to be correct, since they were not displaced from our homeland repeatedly as the Ashkenazi Jews. The Jews who lived in Spain have been there since the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, the second until the Spanish expulsion, about 1,300 years, whereas the Ashkenazi have been forced to wander from one country to another many times. Therefore, it is likely the Jews from Spain retained the same manner of pronunciation as they had in our homeland. Furthermore, Sephardic Jews who live in the Middle East, where Semitic languages have always been spoken, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, since the destruction of the first Bet HaMikdash. The Ashkenazi Jews were scattered in lands where they had no contact with ancient communities, and therefore their pronunciation was influenced by the non-Jewish languages and the cultures that they encountered with whom they had social, right, and commercial intercourse. The same right sentiment was written by Rav Yaakov David Wolosky. He says, Betrid Baz, in a letter from Yosef Chaim Yosef Delunid, he writes, who immigrated to Yerushalayim from Aleppo, he says, I tend to think that your tradition regarding pronunciation of Hebrew is much more likely correct than ours, since my ancestors were forced to wander from country to country, whereas the communities were very, very stable. Okay? Fine. So, he says like this, Rav Natan Adler. Okay? So he says now like this, that Tzror HaChaim testifies that Rav Natan Adler of Frankfurt recited his prayers using the Sephardic tradition of pronunciation. Rav Adler hosted a resident of Yerushalayim, right, in his home, right, for 2 or 3 years in order to learn from the correct way to pronounce the Hebrew tradition. The second is he had somebody there, right, in order to come and to, right, and to have, mamash, he wanted to learn the tradition of the Sfaradim, right? He says this guest was Arav Chaim Modai, author of Chaim Lolam. Who would dare question the actions of this? Who's going to? This is Rav Nathan Adler. Rav Nathan Adler was the rabbi of the Khatam Sofet. Obviously, if it took him too long to perfect his imitation Sephardic proper pronunciation, imagine how many years it would take for ordinary people like us. Nevertheless, the step was not imitated by other Torah scholars of his day. The Rishonim Zion commented on this. Here we see a great Torah scholar who was born to an Ashkenazic family, lived in Ashkenazic communities, yet he considered it vital to learn how to pronounce the Hebrew in the Sephardic tradition, and in order to pray and say the brachot. Certainly those people who are privileged to be educated in Israel to pronounce Hebrew in the Sephardic can continue to pronounce it in this way. It is not necessary for them to change it back to their father's tradition. This is not an infringement of the commandments. Right? Al titosh Torah Tamecha, the Keter Ephraim testified that Rav Yitzchak of Volozhin had the practice of studying Shema every day using the Sephardic pronunciation after praying in the Ashkenazic tradition. It is reported that Rav Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik followed this practice as well. So look, this is to do with, obviously we're going to continue tomorrow with Hashem, but just has to do with the concept of the tradition of Sephardic tradition of the pronunciation.